Chapter 12 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 12. From the 1st of December, the floor of the Haynes Cooper mailroom looked like a New York Stock Exchange after a panic. The aisles were drifts of paper against which a squad of boys struggled as vainly as a gang of snow shovelers against a blizzard. The guide talked in terms of tons of mail instead of thousands, and smacked his lips after it. The 10,000 were working at night now, stopping for a hasty bite of supper at 6, then back to the desk or bin or shelf until 9, so that Oklahoma and Minnesota might have its Christmas box in time. Fanny Brandeis, working under the light of her green-shaded desk lamp, wondered a little bitterly if Christmas would ever mean anything to her but pressure, weariness, work. She told herself that she would not think of that Christmas of 1 year ago. 1 year! As she glanced around the orderly little office and out to the stockroom beyond, then back to her desk again, she had an odd feeling of unreality. Surely it had been not 1 year, but many years, a lifetime, since she had elbowed her way up and down those packed aisles of the busy little store in Winnebago, she and that brisk, alert, courageous woman. "Mrs. Brandeis, lady wants to know if you can't put this blue satin dress on the dark-haired doll, and the pink satin—" "Well, I did tell her, but she said for me to ask you, anyway. Miss Brandeis, this man says he paid $1 down on a go-cart last month, and he wants to pay the rest and take it home with him." And then the reassuring, authoritative voice, "Coming! I'll be right there." Coming! That had been her whole life, service. And now she lay so quietly beneath the snow of the bitter northern winter. At that point Fanny's fist would come down hard on her desk, and the quick, indrawn breath of mutinous resentment would hiss through her teeth. She kept away from the downtown shops and their crowds. She scowled at the sight of the holly and mistletoe wreaths with their crimson streamers. There was something almost ludicrous in the way she shut her eyes to the holiday pageant all around her, and doubled and redoubled her work. It seemed she had a new scheme for her department every other day, and every other one was a good one. Slosson had long ago abandoned the attempt to keep up with her. He did not even resent her as he had at first. "I'm a buyer," he said rather pathetically, "and a pretty good one, too. But I'm not a genius, and I never will be, and I guess you've got to be a genius these days to keep up. It used to be enough for an infants' wear buyer to know muslins, cottons, woolens, silks, and embroideries. But that's old-fashioned now. These days, when you hire an office boy, you don't ask him if he can read and write. You tell him he's got to have personality, magnetism, and imagination. Makes me sick." The baby book came off the presses, and it was good. Even Slosson admitted it, grudgingly. The cover was a sunny, breezy seashore picture, all blue and gold, with plump, dimpled youngsters playing, digging in the sand, romping, and wearing our number 13E1269, etc., of course. Inside were displayed the complete baby outfits, with a smiling mother and a chubby, crowing baby as the central picture, and each piece of each outfit separately pictured. Just below this, the outfit number and price, and a list of the pieces that went to make it up. From the emergency outfit at $3.98 to the outfit deluxe, for Haynes Cooper patrons, at $28.50, each group was comprehensive, practical, complete. In the back of the book was a personal service plea. "Use us," it said. "We are here to assist you, not only in the matter of merchandise, but with information and advice. Mothers in particular are in need of such service. This book will save you weariness and worry. Use us." Fanny surveyed the book with pardonable pride. But she was not satisfied. "We lack style," she said. "The practical garments are all right, but what we need is a little snap. That means cut and line, and I'm going to New York to get it." That had always been Slosson's work. She and Ella Monahan were to go to the Eastern markets together. Ella Monahan went to New York regularly every 3 weeks. Fanny had never been east of Chicago. She envied Ella her knowledge of the New York wholesalers and manufacturers. Ella had dropped into Fanny's office for a brief moment. The two women had little in common except their work, but they got on very well, and each found the other educating. "Seems to me you're putting an awful lot into this," observed Ella Monahan, her wise eyes on Fanny's rather tense face. "You've got to," replied Fanny, "to get anything out of it." "I guess you're right," Ella agreed, and laughed a rueful little laugh. "I know I've given him everything I've got, and a few things I didn't know I had. It's a queer game, life. Now, if my old father hadn't run a tannery in Racine, and if I hadn't run around there all the day, so that I got so that the smell and feel of leather and hides were part of me, why, I'd never be a buyer of gloves at Haynes Cooper. And you Brandeis's Bazaar," and was going on when her office boy came in with a name. Ella rose to go, but Fanny stopped her. "Father Fitzpatrick! Bring him right in. Miss Monahan, you've got to meet him. He's—" Then, as the great frame of the handsome old priest filled the doorway, "He's just Father Fitzpatrick." Ella Monahan. The white-haired Irishman and the white-haired Irishwoman clasped hands. "And who are you, daughter, besides Ella Monahan?" "Buyer of gloves at Haynes Cooper, father." "You don't tell me now!" He turned to Fanny, put his two big hands on her shoulders, and swung her around to face the light. He murmured noncommittally after that. What?" demanded Fanny. "It sounds unflattering, whatever it means." "Gloves," repeated Father Fitzpatrick, unheeding her. "Well, now, what do you think of that? Millions of dollars worth, I'll wager, in your time." "2.5 million in my department last year," replied Ella, without the least trace of boastfulness. One talked only in terms of millions at Haynes Cooper's. "What an age it is, when two slips of women can earn salaries that would make the old kings of Ireland look like beggars." He twinkled upon the older woman. "And what a feeling it must be, independence and all." "I've earned my own living since I was 17, said Ella Monahan. "I'd hate to tell you how long that is." A murmur from the gallant Irishman. "Thanks, father, for the compliment I see in your eyes. But what I mean is this. You're right about independence. It is a grand thing at first. But after a while it begins to pall on you. Don't ask me why. I don't know. I only hope you won't think I'm a wicked woman when I say I could learn to love any man who'd hang a silver fox scarf and a string of pearls around my neck and ask me if I didn't feel a draft." "Wicked! Not a bit of it, my girl. It's only natural and commendable, barrin' the pearls." "I'd forgo them then," laughed Ella, and with a parting handshake left the two alone. Father Fitzpatrick looked after her. "A smart woman, that." He took out his watch, a fat silver one. "It's 11:30. My train leaves at 4. Now, Fanny, if you'll get on your hat and arrange to steal an hour or so from this Brobdingnagian place, a grand word that, my girl, and nearer to swearin' than any word I know, I'll take you to the Blackstone, no less, for lunch. How's that for a poor miserable old priest?" "You, dear, I couldn't think of it. Oh, yes, I could get away, but let's lunch right here at the plant, in the grill." "Never, I couldn't. Don't ask it of me. This place scares me. I came up in the elevator with a crowd and a guide, and he was juggling millions, that chap, the way a newsboy flips a cent. I'm but a poor parish priest, but I've got my pride. We'll go to the Blackstone, which I've passed humbly, but never been in, with its rose silk shades and its window boxes, and we'll be waited on by velvet-footed servitors, me girl. Get your hat." Fanny, protesting, but laughing too, got it. They took the L. Michigan Avenue, as they approached it from Wabash, was windswept and bleak, as only Michigan Avenue can be in December. They entered the warm radiance of the luxurious foyer with a little breathless rush, as wind-blown Chicagoans generally do. The head waiter must have thought Father Fitzpatrick a cardinal, at least, for he seated them at a window table that looked out upon the icy street, with Grant Park crusted with sooty snow just across the way, and beyond that the icy tracks and the great gray lake. The splendid room was all color and perfume and humming conversation. A fountain tinkled in the center, and upon its waters there floated lily pads and blossoms, weirdly rose and mauve and lavender. The tables were occupied by deliciously slim young girls and very self-conscious college boys home for the holidays, and marceled matrons furred and aigretted. The pink in Fanny's cheeks deepened. She loved luxury. She smiled and flashed at the handsome old priest opposite her. "You're a wastrel," she said, "but isn't it nice?" and tasted the first delicious sip of soup. "It is, for a change. Extravagance is good for all of us now and then." He glanced leisurely around the brilliant room, then out to the street, bleakly windswept. He leaned back and drummed a bit with his fingers on the satin-smooth cloth. "Now and then. Tell me, Fanny, what would you say, offhand, was the most interesting thing you see from here? You used to have a trick of picking out what they call the human side. Your mother had it, too." Fanny, smiling, glanced about the room. her eyes unconsciously following the track his had taken. About the room and out to the icy street. "The most interesting thing?" Back to the flower-scented room, with its music and tinkle and animation. Out again to the street. "You see that man standing at the curb across the street? He's sort of crouched against the lamp-post. See him? Yes, there, just this side of that big gray car. He's all drawn up in a heap. You can feel him shivering. He looks as if he were trying to crawl inside himself for warmth. Ever since we came in I've noticed him staring straight across at these windows where we're all sitting so grandly lunching. I know what he's thinking, don't you? And I wish I didn't feel so uncomfortable knowing it. I wish we hadn't ordered lobster thermidor. I wish there! The policeman's moving him on." Father Fitzpatrick reached over and took her hand, as it lay on the table, in his great grasp. "Fanny girl, you have told me what I wanted to know. Haynes Cooper or no Haynes Cooper, millions or no millions, your ravines aren't choked up with ashes yet, my dear. Thank God." End of chapter 12. Part 1 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 13. From now on, Fanny Brandeis's life became such a swift-flowing thing that your trilogist would have regarded her with disgust. Here was no slow unfolding, petal by petal. Here were two processes going on side by side. Fanny, the woman of business, flourished and throve like a weed, arrogantly flaunting its head above the timid, white flower that lay close to the soil and crept and spread and multiplied. Between the two, the fight went on silently. Fate or chance, or whatever it is that directs our movements, was forever throwing tragic or comic little life groups in her path, and then pointing an arresting finger at her, implying, "This means you." Fanny stepped over those obstructions, or walked around them, or stared straight through them. She had told herself that she would observe the first anniversary of her mother's death with none of those ancient customs by which your pious Jew honors his dead. There would be no Yahrzeit light burning for 24 hours. She would not go to temple for Kaddish prayer. But the thing was too strong for her, too anciently inbred. Her ancestors would have lighted a candle, or an oil lamp. Fanny, coming home at 6, found herself turning on the shaded electric lamp in her hall. She went through to the kitchen. "Princess, when you come in tomorrow morning you'll find a light in the hall. Don't turn it off until tomorrow evening at 6. "All day long, Miss Fan? My sakes, what fo'?" "It's just a religious custom." "Didn't know yo' had no religion, Miss Fan. Leastways, I never could figure." "I haven't," said Fanny shortly. "Dinner ready soon, Princess? I'm starved." She had entered a Jewish house of worship only once in this year. It was the stately, white-columned edifice on Grand Boulevard that housed the congregation presided over by the famous Kirsch. She had heard of him, naturally. She was there out of curiosity, like any other newcomer to Chicago. The beauty of the auditorium enchanted her. A magnificently proportioned room, and restful without being in the least gloomy. Then she had been interested in the congregation as it rustled in. She thought she had never seen so many modishly gowned women in one room in all her life. The men were sleekly broadcloth, but they lacked the well-dressed air, somehow. The women were slimly elegant in tailored suits and furs. They all looked as if they had been turned out by the same tailor. An artist in his line, but of limited imagination. Dr. Kirsch, sociologist and savant, aquiline, semi-bald, grimly satiric, sat in his splendid high-backed chair, surveying his silken flock through half-closed lids. He looked tired and rather ill, Fanny thought, but distinctly a personage. She wondered if he held them or they him. That recalled to her the little Winnebago temple and Rabbi Thalmann. She remembered the frequent rudeness and open inattention of that congregation. No doubt Mrs. Nathan Pereles had her counterpart here, and the hypocritical Bella Weinberg, too, and the giggling Aarons girls and old Ben Reitman. Here Dr. Kirsch had risen, and coming forward, had paused to lean over his desk and, with an awful geniality, had looked down upon two rustling, exquisitely gowned latecomers. They sank into their seats, cowed. Fanny grinned. He began his lecture, something about modern politics. Fanny was fascinated and resentful by turns. His brilliant satire probed, cut, jabbed like a surgeon's scalpel, or he railed, scolded, snarled like a dyspeptic schoolmaster. Often he was in wretched taste. He mimicked, postured, sneered. But he had this millionaire congregation of his in hand. Fanny found herself smiling up at him delightedly. Perhaps this wasn't religion, as she had been taught to look upon it, but it certainly was tonic. She told herself that she would have come to the same conclusion if Kirsch had occupied a Methodist pulpit. There were no Kaddish prayers in Kirsch's temple. On the Friday following the first anniversary of Molly Brandeis's death, Fanny did not go home after working hours, but took a bite of supper in a neighborhood restaurant. Then she found her way to one of the Orthodox Russian Jewish synagogues on the west side. It was a dim, odorous, bare little place, this house of worship. Fanny had never seen one like it before. She was herded up into the gallery where the women sat, and when the patriarchal rabbi began to intone the prayer for the dead, Fanny threw the gallery into wide panic by rising for it, a thing that no woman is allowed to do in an Orthodox Jewish church. She stood calmly, though the beshawled woman to right and left of her yanked at her coat. In January, Fanny discovered New York. She went as selector for her department. Hereafter Slosson would only do the actual buying. Styles, prices, and materials would be decided by her. Ella Monahan accompanied her, it being the time for her monthly trip. Fanny openly envied her knowledge of New York's wholesale district. Ella offered to help. "No," Fanny had replied, "I think not, thanks. You've your own work. And besides, I know pretty well what I want, and where to go to get it. It's making them give it to me that will be hard." They went to the same hotel and took connecting rooms. Each went her own way, not seeing the other from morning until night, but they often found kimonoed comfort in each other's presence. Fanny had spent weeks outlining her plan of attack. She had determined to retain the cheap grades, but to add a finer line as well. She recalled those lace-bedecked bundles that the farmer women and mill hands had borne so tenderly in their arms. Here was one direction in which they allowed extravagance free rein. As a canny businesswoman, she would trade on her knowledge of their weakness. A Haynes Cooper order is never a thing to be despised by a wholesaler. Fanny, knowing this, had made up her mind to go straight to Horn & Udell. Now Horn & Udell are responsible for the bloomers your small daughter wears under her play frock, in place of the troublesome and extravagant petticoat of the old days. It was they who introduced smocked pinafores to you, and those modish patent leather belts for children at which your grandmothers would have raised horrified hands. They taught you that an inch of hand embroidery is worth a yard of cheap lace. And as for style, cut, line, you can tell a Horn & Udell child from among a flock of 30. Fanny, entering their office, felt much as Molly Brandeis had felt that January many, many years before, when she had made that first terrifying trip to the Chicago market. The engagement had been made days before. Fanny never knew the shock that her youthful, expectant face gave old Sid Udell. He turned from his desk to greet her, his polite smile of greeting giving way to a look of bewilderment. "But you are not the buyer, are you, Miss Brandeis?" "No, Mr. Slosson buys." "I thought so." "But I select for my entire department. I decide on our styles, materials, and prices, 6 months in advance. Then Mr. Slosson does the actual bulk buying." "Something newfangled?" inquired Sid Udell. "Of course, we've never sold much to you people. Our stuff is—" "Yes, I know. But you'd like to, wouldn't you?" "Our class of goods isn't exactly suited to your wants." "Yes, it is, exactly. That's why I'm here. We'll be doing a business of $1.25 million in my department in another 2 years. No firm, not even Horn & Udell, can afford to ignore an account like that." Sid Udell smiled a little. "You've made up your mind to that $1.25 million, young lady?" "Yes." "Well, I've dealt with buyers for a quarter of a century or more, and I'd say that you're going to get it." Whereupon Fanny began to talk. 10 minutes later Udell interrupted her to summon Horn, whose domain was the factory. Horn came, was introduced, looked doubtful. Fanny had statistics. Fanny had arguments. She had determination. "And what we want," she went on in her quiet, assured way, "is style. The Horn & Udell clothes have chic. Now material can't be imitated successfully, but style can. Our goods lack just that. I could copy any model you have, Turn the idea over to a cheap manufacturer and get 1,000,000 just like it at 1/5 the price. That isn't a threat. It's just a business statement that you know to be true. I can sketch from memory anything I've seen once. What I want to know is this. Will you make it necessary for me to do that, or will you undertake to furnish us with cheaper copies of your high-priced designs? We could use your entire output. I know the small-town woman of the poorer class, and I know she'll wear a shawl in order to give her child a cloth coat with fancy buttons and a velvet collar." And Horn and Udell, whose attitude at first had been that of two seasoned business men dealing with a precocious child, found themselves quoting prices to her, shipments, materials, quality, quantities. Then came the question of time. "We'll get out a special catalog for the summer," Fanny said. "A small one to start them our way. Then the big fall catalog will contain the entire line." "That doesn't give us time!" exclaimed both men in a breath. "But you must manage somehow. Can't you speed up the workroom? Put on extra hands? It's worth it." They might, under normal conditions. But there was this strike talk, its ugly head bobbing up in 100 places, and their goods were the kind that required high-class workers. Their girls earned all the way from $12 to $25. But Fanny knew she had driven home the entering wedge. She left them after making an engagement for the following day. The Horn and Udell factory was in New York's newer loft building section, around Madison, Fifth Avenue, and the 30s. Her hotel was very near. She walked up Fifth Avenue a little way, and as she walked she wondered why she did not feel more elated. Her day's work had exceeded her expectations. It was a brilliant January afternoon, with a snap in the air that was almost western. Fifth Avenue flowed up, flowed down, and Fanny fought the impulse to stare after every second or third woman she passed. They were so invariably well dressed. There was none of the occasional shabbiness or dowdiness of Michigan Avenue. Every woman seemed to have emerged fresh from the hands of masseuse and maid. Their hair was coiffed to suit the angle of the hat, and the hat had been chosen to enhance the contour of the head, and the head was carried with regard for the dark furs that encircled the throat. They were amazingly well shod. Their white gloves were white, a fact remarkable to any soot-haunted Chicagoan. Their coloring rivaled the rose leaf, and nobody's nose was red. "Goodness knows I've never pretended to be a beauty," Fanny said that evening, in conversation with Ella Monahan. "But I've always thought I had my good points. By the time I'd reached 42nd Street I wouldn't have given 2 cents for my chances of winning a cave man on a desert island." She made up her mind that she would go back to the hotel, get a thick coat, and ride outside one of those fascinating Fifth Avenue buses. It struck her as an ideal way to see this amazing street. She was back at her hotel in 10 minutes. Ella had not yet come in. Their rooms were on the 10th floor. Fanny got her coat, peered at her own reflection in the mirror, sighed, shook her head, and was off down the hall toward the elevators. The great hall window looked toward Fifth Avenue, but between it and the avenue rose a yellow brick building that housed tier on tier of manufacturing lofts. Cloaks, suits, blouses, petticoats, hats, dresses. It was just such a building as Fanny had come from when she had left the offices of Horn and Udell. It might be their very building, for all she knew. She looked straight into its windows as she stood waiting for the lift, and window after window showed women sewing. They were sewing at machines, and at handwork, but not as women are accustomed to sew, with leisurely stitches, stopping to pat a seam here, to run a calculating eye along a hem or ruffle. It was dreadful, mechanical motion, that sewing, a machine-like, relentless motion, with no waste in it, no pause. Fanny's mind leaped back to Winnebago, with its pleasant porches on which leisurely women sat stitching peacefully at a fine seam. What was it she had said to Udell? "Can't you speed up the workroom? It's worth it." Fanny turned abruptly from the window as the door of the bronze and mirrored lift opened for her. She walked over to Fifth Avenue again and up to 45th Street. Then she scrambled up the spiral stairs of a Washington Square bus. The air was crisp, clear, intoxicating. To her Chicago eyes the buildings, the streets, the very sky looked startlingly fresh and new-washed. As the bus lurched down Fifth Avenue she leaned over the railing to stare, fascinated, at the colorful, shifting, brilliant panorama of the most amazing street in the world. Block after block, as far as the eye could see, the gorgeous procession moved up, moved down, and the great gleaming motor cars crept, and crawled, and writhed in and out, like nothing so much as swollen angleworms in a fishing can, Fanny thought. Her eye was caught by one limousine that stood out, even in that crush of magnificence. It was all black, as though scorning to attract the eye with vulgar color, and it was lined with white. Fanny thought it looked very much like Siegel and Cohen's hearse back in Winnebago. In it sat a woman, all furs and orchids and complexion. She was holding up to the window a little dog with a wrinkled and weary face, like that of an old, old man. He was sticking his little evil, eager red tongue out at the world. And he wore a very smart and woolly white sweater, of the imported kind, with a monogram done in black. The traffic policeman put up his hand. The bus rumbled on down the street. Names that had always been remotely mythical to her now met her eye and became realities. Maillard's. And that great red stone castle was the Waldorf. Almost historic, and it looked newer than the smoke-grimed Blackstone. And straight ahead, why, that must be the Flatiron Building. It loomed up like the giant prow of an unimaginable ship. Brentano's, the Holland House, Madison Square. Why, there never was anything so terrifying and beautiful and palpitating and exquisite as this Fifth Avenue in the late winter afternoon, with the sky ahead a rosy mist, and the golden lights just beginning to spangle the gray. At Madison Square she decided to walk. She negotiated the bus steps with surprising skill for a novice, and scurried along the perilous crossing to the opposite side. She entered Madison Square. But why hadn't O. Henry emphasized its beauty instead of its squalor? It lay, a purple pool of shadow, surrounded by the great, gleaming, many-windowed office buildings, like an amethyst sunk in a circle of diamonds. It's a fairyland, Fanny told herself. Who'd have thought a city could be so beautiful? And then at her elbow a voice said, "Oh, lady, for the love of God!" She turned with a jerk and looked up into the unshaven face of a great, blue-eyed giant who pulled off his cap and stood twisting it in his swollen blue fingers. "Lady, I'm cold. I'm hungry. I've been sitting here hours." Fanny clutched her bag a little fearfully. She looked at his huge frame. "Why don't you work?" "Work?" He laughed. "There ain't any. Look at this." He turned up his foot, and you saw the bare sole, blackened and horrible, and fringed comically by the tattered leather upper. "Oh, my dear!" said Fanny, and at that the man began to cry, weakly, sickeningly, like a little boy. "Don't do that! Don't! Here!" She was emptying her purse, and something inside her was saying, "You fool! He's only a professional beggar." And then the man wiped his face with his cap, and swallowed hard, and said, "I don't want all you got. I ain't holding you up. Just give me that. I've been sitting here on that bench, looking at that sign across the street. Over there. It says, 'Eat.' It goes off and on, seeming like it was driving me crazy." Fanny thrust a crumpled $5 bill into his hand, and was off. She fairly flew along, so that it was not until she had reached 33rd Street that she said aloud, as was her way when moved, "I don't care. Don't blame me. It was that miserable little beast of a dog in the white sweater that did it." It was almost 7 when she reached her room. A maid in neat black and white was just coming out with an armful of towels. "I just brought you a couple of extra towels. We were short this morning," she said. The room was warm and quiet and bright. In her bathroom, that glistened with blue and white tiling, were those redundant towels. Fanny stood in the doorway and counted them whimsically. 4 great fuzzy bath towels. 8 glistening hand towels. A blue and white bath rug hung at the side of the tub. Her telephone rang. It was Ella. "Where in the world have you been, child? I was worried about you. I thought you were lost in the streets of New York." "I took a bus ride," Fanny explained. "See anything of New York?" "I saw all of it," replied Fanny. Ella laughed at that, but Fanny's face was serious. "How did you make out at Horn & Udell's? Never mind, I'm coming in for a minute. Can I?" "Please do. I need you." A moment later Ella bounced in, fresh as to blouse, pink as to cheeks. Her whole appearance a testimony to the revivifying effects of a warm bath, a brief nap, clean clothes. "Dear child, you look tired. I'm not going to stay. You get dressed and I'll meet you for dinner. Or do you want yours up here?" "Oh, no." "Phone me when you're dressed. But tell me, isn't it a wonder, this town? I'll never forget my first trip here. I spent one whole evening standing in front of the mirror, trying to make those little spit curls the women were wearing then. I'd seen 'em on Fifth Avenue, and it seemed I'd die if I couldn't have 'em too. And I dabbed on rouge and touched up my eyebrows. I don't know. It's a kind of crazy feeling gets you. The minute I got on the train for Chicago I washed my face and took my hair down and did it plain again." "Why, that's the way I felt," laughed Fanny. "I didn't care anything about infants' wear, or Haynes Cooper, or anything. I just wanted to be beautiful, as they all were. Sure, it gets us all." Fanny twisted her hair into the relentless knob women assumed preparatory to bathing. "It seems to me you have to come from Winnebago or thereabouts to get New York. Really get it, I mean." "That's so," agreed Ella. "There's a man on the New York Star who writes a column every day that everybody reads. If he isn't a small town man, then we're both wrong." Fanny, bath bound, turned to stare at Ella. "A column about what?" "Oh, everything. New York, mostly. Says it's the humanest stuff. He says the kind of thing we'd all say, if we knew how. Reading him is like getting a letter from home. I'll bet he went to a country school and wore his mittens sewed to a piece of tape that ran through his coat sleeves." "You're right," said Fanny. "He did. That man's from Winnebago, Wisconsin." "No!" "Yes." "Do you mean you know him? Honestly? What's he like?" But Fanny had vanished. "I'm a tired business woman," she called back, above the splashing that followed, "and I won't converse until I'm fed." "But how about Horn & Udell?" demanded Ella, her mouth against the crack. "Practically mine," boasted Fanny. "You mean landed?" "Well, hooked, at any rate, and putting up a very poor struggle." "Why, you clever little devil, you! You'll be making me look like a stock girl next." Fanny did not telephone Hale until the day she left New York. She had told herself she would not telephone him at all. He had sent her his New York address and telephone number months before, after that Sunday at the dunes. Ella Monahan had finished her work and had gone back to Chicago 4 days before Fanny was ready to leave. In those 4 days Fanny had scoured the city from the Palisades to Pell Street. I don't know how she found her way about. It was sort of instinct with her. She seemed to scent the picturesque. She never for a moment neglected her work. But she had found it was often impossible to see these New York business men until 10, sometimes 11, o'clock. She awoke at 7, a habit formed in her Winnebago days. 8:30 one morning found her staring up at the dim vastness of the dome of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. The great gray pile, mountainous, almost ominous, looms up in the midst of the dingy commonplaceness of Amsterdam Avenue and 110th Street. New Yorkers do not know this, or if they know it, the fact does not interest them. New Yorkers do not go to stare up into the murky shadows of this glorious edifice. They would if it were situate in Rome. Bare, crude, unfinished, chaotic, it gives rich promise of magnificent fulfillment. In an age when great structures are thrown up today, to be torn down tomorrow, this slow-moving giant is at once a reproach and an example. 25 years in building, 25 more for completion, it has elbowed its way, stone by stone, into such company as St. Peter's at Rome and the Marvel at Milan. Fanny found her way down the crude cinder paths that made an alley-like approach to the cathedral. She entered at the side door that one found by following arrows posted on the rough wooden fence. Once inside, she stood a moment, awed by the immensity of the half-finished nave. As she stood there, hands clasped, her face turned raptly up to where the massive granite columns reared their height to frame the choir, she was, for the moment, as devout as any Episcopalian whose money had helped make the great building. Not only devout, but prayerful, ecstatic. That was partly due to the effect of the pillars, the lights, the tapestries, the great unfinished chunks of stone that loomed out from the side walls, and the purple shadow cast by the window above the chapels at the far end, and partly to the actress in her that responded magically to any mood and always to surroundings. Later she walked softly down the deserted nave, past the choir, to the cluster of chapels, set like gems at one end, and running from north to south in a semicircle. A placard outside one said, "St. Saviour's Chapel, for those who wish to rest and pray." All white marble, this little nook, gleaming softly in the gray half-light. Fanny entered and sat down. She was quite alone. The roar and crash of the 8th Avenue L, the Amsterdam cars, the motors drumming up Morningside Hill were softened here to a soothing hum. For those who wish to rest and pray. Fanny Brandeis had neither rested nor prayed since that hideous day when she had hurled her prayer of defiance at him. But something within her now began a groping for words that should follow an ancient plea beginning, "O God of my fathers." But at that the picture of the room came back to her mental vision. The room so quiet except for the breathing of the woman on the bed, the woman with the tolerant, humorous mouth, and the straight, clever nose, and the softly bright brown eyes, all so strangely pinched and shrunken-looking now. Fanny got to her feet, with a noisy scraping of the chair on the stone floor. The vague, half-formed prayer died at birth. She found her way out of the dim, quiet little chapel, up the long aisle, and out the great door. She shivered a little in the cold of the early January morning as she hurried toward the Broadway subway. At 9:30 she was standing at a counter in the infants' wear section at Beth's, making mental notes while the unsuspecting saleswoman showed her how the pink ribbon in this year's models was brought under the beading, French fashion, instead of weaving through it as heretofore. At 10:30 she was saying to Sid Udell, "I think a written contract is always best. Then we'll all know just where we stand. Mr. Fenger will be out next week to arrange the details, but just now a very brief written understanding to show him on my return would do." And she got it, and tucked it away in her bag in triumph. She tried to leave New York without talking to Hale, but some quiet, insistent force impelled her to act contrary to her resolution. It was, after all, the urge of the stronger wish against the weaker. When he heard her voice over the telephone, Hale did not say, "Who is this?" Neither did he put those inevitable questions of the dweller to the transient. "Where are you? How long have you been here?" What he said was, "How are you going to avoid dining with me tonight?" To which Fanny replied promptly, "By taking the 20th Century back to Chicago today." A little silence. A hurt silence. Then, "When they get the 20th Century habit they're as good as lost. How's the infants' wear business, Fanny?" "Booming, thank you. I want to tell you I've read the column every day. It's wonderful stuff." "It's a wonderful job. I'm a lucky boy. I'm doing the thing I'd rather do than anything else in the world. There are mighty few who can say that." There was another silence, awkward, heavy. Then, "Fanny, you're not really leaving today." "I'll be in Chicago tomorrow, barring wrecks." "You might have let me show you our more or less fair city." "I've shown it to myself. I've seen Riverside Drive at sunset and at night. That alone would have been enough. But I've seen Fulton Market, too, and the Grand Street stalls, and Washington Square, and Central Park, and Lady Duff Gordon's inner showroom, and the Night Court, and the Grand Central Subway horror at 6 p.m., and the gambling on the curb, and the bench sleepers in Madison Square. Oh, Clancy, the misery!" "Hey, wait a minute. All this alone?" "Yes. And one more thing. I've landed Horn & Udell, which means nothing to you, but to me it means that by spring my department will be a credit to its stepmother, a real success." "I knew it would be a success. So did you. Anything you might attempt would be successful. You'd have made a successful lawyer, or cook, or actress, or hydraulic engineer, because you couldn't do a thing badly. It isn't in you. You're a superlative sort of person. But that's no reason for being any of those things. If you won't admit a debt to humanity, surely you'll acknowledge you've an obligation to yourself." "Preaching again. Good bye." "Fanny, you're afraid to see me." "Don't be ridiculous. Why should I be?" "Because I say out loud the things you daren't let yourself think. If I were to promise not to talk about anything but flannel bands—" "Will you promise?" "No. But I'm going to meet you at the clock at the Grand Central Station 15 minutes before train time. I don't care if every infants' wear manufacturer in New York had a prior claim on your time. You may as well be there, because if you're not, I'll get on the train and stay on as far as Albany. Take your choice." He was there before her. Fanny, following the wake of a redcap, picked him at once from among the crowd of clock waiters. He saw her at the same time, and started forward with that singularly lithe, springy step which was, after all, just the result of perfectly trained muscles in coordination. He was wearing New York clothes, the right kind, Fanny noted. Their hands met. "How well you look," said Fanny, rather lamely. "It's the clothes," said Hale, and began to revolve slowly, coyly, hands out, palms down, eyelids drooping, in delicious imitation of those ladies whose business it is to revolve thus for fashion. "Clancy, you idiot! All these people! Stop it!" "But get the grace. Get the easy English hang, at once so loose and so clinging." Fanny grinned appreciatively, and led the way through the gate to the train. She was surprisingly glad to be with him again. On discovering that, she began to talk rapidly, and about him. "Tell me, how do you manage to keep that fresh viewpoint? Everybody else who comes to New York to write loses his identity. The city swallows him up. I mean by that things seem to strike you as freshly as they did when you first came. I remember you wrote me an amazing letter." "For one thing, I've never been anything but a foreigner in New York. I'll never quite believe Broadway. I'll never cease to marvel at Fifth Avenue and Cooper Union and the Bronx. The time may come when I can take the subway for granted, but don't ask it of me just yet." "But the other writers, and all those people who live down in Washington Square?" "I never see them. It's sure death. Those Greenwichers are always taking out their own feelings and analyzing them, and pawing them over and passing them around. When they get through with them they're so thumb-marked and greasy that no one else wants them. They don't get enough golf, those Greenwichers. They don't get enough tennis. They don't get enough walking in the open spaces. Gosh, no! I know better than to fall for that kind of thing. They spend hours talking to each other in dim-lighted attics about souls and society and the joy of life and the greater good, and they know all about each other's insides. They talk themselves out, and there's nothing left to write about. A little of that kind of thing purges and cleanses. Too much of it poisons and clogs. No, ma'am. When I want to talk I go down and chin with the foreman of our composing room. There's a chap that has what I call conversation. A philosopher, and knows everything in the world. Composing room foremen always are, and do. Now that's all of that. How about Fanny Brandeis? Any sketches? Come on, confess. Grand Street, anyway." "I haven't touched a pencil, except to add up a column of figures or copy an order, since last September, when you were so sure I couldn't stop." "You've done 1,000 in your head, and if you haven't done one on paper, so much the better. You'll jam them back and stifle them, and screw the cover down tight on every natural impulse, and then, some day, the cover will blow off with a loud report. You can't kill that kind of thing, Fanny. It would have to be a wholesale massacre of all the centuries behind you. I don't so much mind your being disloyal to your tribe, or race, or whatever you want to call it. But you've turned your back on yourself. You've got an obligation to humanity, and I'll nag you till you pay it. I don't care if I lose you, so long as you find yourself. The thing you've got isn't merely racial. God, no. It's universal. And you owe it to the world. Pay up, Fanny. Pay up." "Look here," began Fanny, her voice low with anger. "The last time I saw you I said I'd never again put myself in a position to be lectured by you like a schoolgirl. I mean it this time. If you have anything else to say to me, say it now. The train leaves," she glanced at her wrist, "in 2 minutes, thank heaven, and this will be your last chance." "All right," said Hale. "I've got something to say. Do you wear hatpins?" "Hatpins?" blankly. "Not with this small hat. But what—" "That means you're defenseless. If you're going to prowl the streets of Chicago alone, get this. If you double your fist this way, and tuck your thumb alongside like that, and aim for this spot right here, about 2 inches this side of the chin, bringing your arm back and up quickly like a piston, the person you hit will go down, limp. There's a nerve right there that communicates with the brain. That blow makes you see stars, bright lights and fancy colors. They use it in the comic papers." "You are crazy," said Fanny, as though at last assured of a long suspected truth. The train began to move almost imperceptibly. "Run!" she cried. Hale sped up the aisle. At the door he turned. "It's called an uppercut," he shouted to the amazement of the other passengers, and leaped from the train. Fanny sank into her seat, weakly. Then she began to laugh, and there was a dash of hysteria in it. He had left a paper on the car seat. It was the Star. Fanny crumpled it childishly and kicked it under the seat. She took off her hat, arranged her belongings, and sat back with eyes closed. After a few minutes she opened them, fished about under the seat for the crumpled copy of the Star, and read it, turning at once to his column. She thought it was a very unpretentious thing, that column, and yet so full of insight and sagacity and whimsical humor. Not a guffaw in it, but a smile in every 5th line. She wondered if those years of illness and loneliness, with weeks of reading and tramping and climbing in the Colorado mountains, had kept him strangely young, or made him strangely old. She welcomed the hours that lay between New York and Chicago. They would give her an opportunity to digest the events of the past 10 days. In her systematic mind she began to range them in the order of their importance. Horn and Udell came first, of course, and then the line of maternity dresses she had selected to take the place of the hideous models carried under Slosson's regime. And then the slip-over pinafores. But somehow her thoughts became jumbled here, so that faces instead of garments filled her mind's eye. Again and again there swam into her ken the face of that woman of 50, in decent widow's weeds, who had stood there in the night court, charged with drunkenness on the streets, and the man with the frostbitten fingers in Madison Square, and the dog in the sweater, and the feverish concentration of the piecework sewers in the window of the loft building. She gave it up, selected a magazine, and decided to go in to lunch. End of Part 1 of Chapter 13. Part 2 of Chapter 13 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 13, Part 2. There was nothing spectacular about the welcome she got on her return to the office after this first trip. A firm that counts its employees by the thousands and its profits in the tens of millions cannot be expected to draw up formal resolutions of thanks when a heretofore flabby department begins to show signs of red blood. Ella Monahan said, "They'll make light of it, all but Fenger. That's their way." Slosson drummed with his fingers all the time she was giving him the result of her work in terms of style, material, quantity, time, and price. When she had finished, he said, "Well, all I can say is we seem to be going out of the mail order business and into the imported novelty line, de luxe. I suppose by next Christmas the grocery department will be putting in artichoke hearts and truffles, and French champagne by the keg for community orders." To which Fanny had returned sweetly, "If Oregon and Wyoming show any desire for artichokes and champagne, I don't see why we shouldn't." Fenger, strangely enough, said little. He was apt to be rather curt these days, and almost irritable. Fanny attributed it to the reaction following the strain of the Christmas rush. One did not approach Fenger's office except by appointment. Fanny sent word to him of her return. For 2 days she heard nothing from him. Then the voice of the snuff-brown secretary summoned her. She did not have to wait this time, but passed directly through the big, bright outer room into the smaller room. The powerhouse, Fanny called it. Fenger was facing the door. "Missed you," he said. "You must have," Fanny laughed, "with only 9,999 to look after." "You look as if you'd been on a vacation instead of a test trip." "So I have. Why didn't you warn me that business, as transacted in New York, is a series of social rites? I didn't have enough white kid gloves to go round. No one will talk business in an office. I don't see what they use offices for, except as places in which to receive their mail. You utter the word 'business,' and the other person immediately says 'lunch.' No wholesaler seems able to quote you his prices until he has been sustained by half a dozen Cape Cods. I don't want to see a restaurant or a rose silk shade for weeks." Fenger tapped the little pile of papers on his desk. "I've read your reports. If you can do that on lunches, I'd like to see what you could put over in a series of dinners." "Heaven forbid," said Fanny fervently. Then, for a very concentrated 15 minutes, they went over the reports together. Fanny's voice grew dry and lifeless as she went into the figures. "You don't sound particularly enthusiastic," Fenger said, when they had finished, "considering that you've accomplished what you set out to do." "That's just it," quickly. "I like the uncertainty. It was interesting to deal directly with those people, to stack one's arguments and personality and mentality and power over theirs until they had to give way. But after that, well, you can't expect me to be vitally interested in gross lots and carloads and dating." "It's part of business." "It's the part I hate." Fenger stacked the papers neatly. "You came in June, didn't you?" "Yes." "It has been a remarkable 8 months' record, even at Haynes Cooper's, where records are the rule. Have you been through the plant since the time you first went through?" "Through it? Goodness, no. It would take a day." "Then I wish you'd take it. I like to have the heads of departments go through the plant at least twice a year. You'll find the 14th floor has been cleared and is being used entirely by the selectors. The manufacturer's samples are spread on the tables in the various sections. You'll find your place ready for you. You'll be amused at Daly's section. He took your suggestion about trying the blouses on live models instead of selecting them as he used to. You remember you said that one could tell about the lines and style of a dress merely by looking at it, but that a blouse is just a limp rag until it's on? It's true of the flimsy Georgette things women want now. They may be lovely in the box, and hideously unbecoming when worn. If Daly's going for the higher grade stuff, he can't risk choosing unbecoming models." "Wait until you see him," smiled Fenger, "sitting there like a sultan while the pinks and blues and whites and plaids parade before him." He turned to his desk again. "That's all, Miss Brandeis. Thank you." Then, at a sudden thought, "Do you know that all your suggestions have been human suggestions? I mean, they all have had to do with people. Tell me, how do you happen to have learned so much about what people feel and think in such a short time?" The thing that Clarence Hail had said flashed through her mind, and she was startled to find herself quoting it. "It hasn't been a short time," she said. "It took 1,000 years." And left Fenger staring, puzzled. She took next morning for her tour of the plant as Fenger had suggested. She went through it, not as the startled, wide-eyed girl of 8 months before had gone, but critically, and with a little unconscious air of authority. For this organization, vast though it was, actually showed her imprint. She could have put her finger on this spot and that, saying, "Here is the mark of my personality." And she thought as she passed from department to department, 10,000 a year if you keep on as you've started. Up one aisle and down the next. Bundles, bundles, bundles. And everywhere you saw the yellow order slips. In the hands of the stock boys whizzing by on roller skates. In the filing department. In the traffic department. The very air seemed jaundiced with those clouds of yellow order slips. She stopped a moment, fascinated, as always, before the main spiral gravity chute down which the bundles, hundreds of them, thousands of them daily, chased each other to what? Fanny asked herself. She knew vaguely that hands caught these bundles halfway and redirected them toward the proper channel, where they were assembled and made ready for shipping or mailing. She turned to a stock boy. "Where does this empty?" she asked. "Floor below," said the boy, "on the platform." Fanny walked down a flight of iron stairs, and around to face the spiral chute again. In front of the chute, and connected with it by a great metal lip, was a platform perhaps 12 feet above the floor, and looking very much like the pilot's deck of a ship. A little flight of stairs led up to it, very steep stairs, that trembled a little under a repetition of shocks that came from above. Fanny climbed them warily, gained the top, and found herself standing next to the girl whose face had gleamed out at her from among those thousands in the crowd pouring out of the plant. The girl glanced up at Fanny for a second. No, for the fraction of a second. Her job was the kind that permitted no more than that. Fanny watched her for one breathless moment. In that moment she understood the look that had been stamped on the girl's face that night, the look that had cried, "Release." For this platform, shaking under the thud of bundles, 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 was the stomach of the Haynes Cooper plant. 60% of the 45,000 daily orders passed through the hands of this girl and her assistants. Down the chutes swished the bundles, stamped with their section mark, and here they were caught deftly and hurled into one of the dozen conveyors that flowed out from this main stream. The wrong bundle into the wrong conveyor? Confusion in the shipping room. It only took a glance of the eye and a motion of the arms. But that glance and that motion had been boiled down to the very concentrated essence of economy. They seemed to be working with fury, but then, so does a pile driver when you get the simplicity of it. Fanny bent over the girl, it was a noisy corner, and put a question. The girl did not pause in her work as she answered it. She caught a bundle with one hand, hurled one into a conveyor with the other. "7 a week," she said, and deftly caught the next slithering bundle. Fanny watched her for another moment. Then she turned and went down the steep stairs. "None of your business," she said to herself, and continued her tour. "None of your business." She went up to the new selectors floor, and found the plan running as smoothly as if it had been part of the plant system for years. The elevator whisked her up to the top floor, where she met the plant's latest practical fad, the new textile chemist, a charming youth disguised in bone-rimmed glasses, who did the honors of his little laboratory with all the manner of a Harvard host. This was the fusing oven for silks. Here was the drying oven. This delicate scale weighed every ounce of the cloth swatches that came in for inspection, to get the percentage of wool and cotton. Not a chance for the manufacturer to slip shoddy into his goods now. Said Fanny politely. She hated complicated processes that had to do with scales and weights and pounds and acids. She crossed over to the administration building and stopped at the door marked Mrs. Knowles. If you had been an employee of the Haynes Cooper Company and had been asked to define Mrs. Knowles' position, the chances are you would have found yourself floundering, wordless. Haynes Cooper was reluctant to acknowledge the need of Mrs. Knowles. Still, when you employ 10,000 people, and more than half of these are girls, and 50% of these girls are unskilled, ignorant, and terribly human, you find that a Mrs. Knowles saves the equivalent of 10 times her salary in wear and tear and general prevention. She could have told you tragic stories, could Mrs. Knowles, and sordid stories, and comic, too. She knew how to deal with terror, and shame, and stubborn silence, and hopeless misery. Gray-haired and motherly? Not at all. An astonishingly young, pleasingly plumpish woman, with nothing remarkable about her except a certain splendid calm. 4 years out of Vassar, and already she had learned that if you fold your hands in your lap and wait, quietly, asking no questions, almost anyone will tell you almost anything. "Hello," called Fanny. "How are our morals this morning?" "Going up," answered Esther Knowles, "considering that it's Tuesday. Come in. How's the infant prodigy? I lunched with Ella Monahan, and she told me your first New York trip was a whirlwind. Congratulations." "Thanks. I can't stop. I haven't touched my desk today. I just wanted to ask you if you know the name of that girl who has charge of the main chute in the merchandise building." "Good Lord, child, there are thousands of girls." "But this one's rather special. She is awfully pretty, and rather different looking. Exquisite coloring, a discontented expression, and a blouse that's too low in the neck." "Which might be a description of Fanny Brandeis herself, barring the blouse," laughed Mrs. Knowles. Then, at the startled look in Fanny's face, "Do forgive me, and don't look so horrified. I think I know which one you mean. Her name is Sarah Sapinsky. Yes, isn't it a pity? And it's queer that you should ask me about her, because I've been having trouble with that particular girl." "Trouble?" "She knows she's pretty, and she knows she's different, and she knows she's handicapped, and that accounts for the discontented expression. That and some other things. She gets 7 a week here, and they take just about all of it at home. She says she's sick of it. She has left home twice. I don't blame the child, but I've always managed to bring her back. Some day there'll be a third time, and I'm afraid of it. She's not bad. She's really rather splendid, and she has a certain dreadful philosophy of her own. Her theory is that there are only two kinds of people in the world, those that give and those that take. And she's tired of giving. Sarah didn't put it just that way, but you know what she means, don't you?" "I know what she means," said Fanny grimly. So it was Sarah she saw above all else in her trip through the gigantic plant. Sarah's face shone out from among the thousands. The thud-thud of Sarah's bundle chute beat a dull accompaniment to the hum of the big hive, above the rustle of those myriad yellow order slips, through the buzz of the busy mail room, beneath the roar of the presses in the printing building, the crash of the dishes in the cafeteria, ran the lead motif of Sarah at 7 a week. Back in her office once more, Fanny dictated a brief observation report for Fenger's perusal. "It seems to me there's room for improvement in our card index file system. It's thorough, but unwieldy. It isn't a system any more. It's a ceremony. Can't you get a corps of system sharks to simplify things there?" She went into detail, and passed on to the next suggestion. "If the North American Cloak and Suit Company can sell mail order dresses that are actually smart and in good taste, I don't see why we have to go on carrying only the most hideous crudities in our women's dress department. I know the majority of our women customers wouldn't wear a plain, good-looking little blue serge dress with a white collar and some tailored buttons. They want cerise satin revers on a plum-colored foulard, and that's what we've been giving them. But there are plenty of other women living miles from anywhere who know what's being worn on Fifth Avenue. I don't know how they know it, but they do, and they want it. Why can't we reach those women as well as their shoddier sisters? The North American people do it. I'd wear one of their dresses myself. I wouldn't be found dead in one of ours. Here's a suggestion. Why can't we get Camille to design half a dozen models a season for us? Now don't roar at that, and don't think that the women on Western ranches haven't heard of Camille. They have. They may know nothing of Mrs. Pankhurst, and Lillian Russell may be a myth to them. But I'll swear that every one of them knows that Camille is a dressmaker who makes super dresses. She is as much a household word among them as Roosevelt used to be to their menfolks. And if we can promise them a Camille designed dress for $7.85, which we could, then why don't we?" At the very end, to her stenographer's mystification, she added this irrelevant line: $7 a week is not a living wage. The report went to Fenger. He hurtled lightly over the first suggestion, knowing that the file system was as simple as a monster of its bulk could be. He ignored the third hint. The second suggestion amused, then interested, then convinced him. Within 6 months Camille's name actually appeared in the Haynes Cooper catalog. Not that alone. The Haynes Cooper Company broke its rule as to outside advertising, and announced in full-page magazine ads the news of the $7.85 gowns designed by Camille especially for the Haynes Cooper Company. There went up a nationwide shout of amusement and unbelief, but the announcement continued. Camille, herself a frump with a fringe, whose frocks were worn by queens and dancers and matrons with millions and debutantes. Camille, who had introduced the slouch, revived the hoop, discovered the sunset chiffon, had actually consented to design 6 models every season for the mail order millions of the Haynes Cooper women's dress department, at a price that made even Michael Fenger wince. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Chapter 14. Fanny Brandeis's blouses showed real Cluny now, and her hats were nothing but line. A scant 2 years before she had wondered if she would ever reach a pinnacle of success lofty enough to enable her to wear blue tailor suits as smart as the well-cut garments worn by her mother's friend, Mrs. Emma McChesney. Mrs. McChesney's trig little suits had cost $50 and had looked 60. Fanny's now cost $125 and looked $125. Her sleeves alone gave it away. If you would test the soul of a tailor, you have only to glance at shoulder seam, elbow, and wrist. Therein lies the wizardry. Fanny's sleeve flowed from armpit to thumb bone without a ripple. Also, she moved from the south side to the north side, always a sign of prosperity or social ambition in Chicago. Her new apartment was near the lake, exhilaratingly high, correspondingly expensive. And she was hideously lonely. She was earning a man-sized salary now, and she was working like a man. A less magnificently healthy woman could not have stood the strain, for Fanny Brandeis was working with her head, not her heart. When we say heart, we have come to mean something more than the hollow muscular structure that propels the blood through the veins. That, in the dictionary, is the primary definition. The secondary definition has to do with such words as emotion, sympathy, tenderness, courage, conviction. She was working now, as Michael Fenger worked, relentlessly, coldly, indomitably, using all the material at hand as a means to an end, with never a thought of the material itself, as a builder reaches for a brick or stone and fits it into place smoothly, almost without actually seeing the brick itself, except as something which will help to make a finished wall. She rarely prowled the city now. She told herself she was too tired at night, and on Sundays and holidays. And I suppose she was. Indeed, she no longer saw things with her former vision. It was as though her soul had shriveled in direct proportion to her salary's expansion. The streets seldom furnished her with a rich mental meal now. When she met a woman with child in the park, her keen eye noted the child's dress before it saw the child itself, if, indeed, she noticed the child at all. Fascinating Facts, the guileless, pink-cheeked youth who had driven her home the night of her first visit to the Fengers, shortly after her coming to Haynes Cooper's, had proved her faithful slave, and she had not abused his devotion. Indeed, she hardly considered it that. The sex side of her was being repressed with the artist side. Most men found her curt, brisk, businesslike manner a little repellent, though interesting. They never made love to her, in spite of her undeniable attractiveness. Fascinating Facts drove her about in his smart little roadster, and one night he established himself in her memory forever as the first man who had ever asked her to marry him. He did it haltingly, painfully, almost grudgingly. Fanny was frankly amazed. She had enjoyed going about with him. He rested and soothed her. He, in turn, had been stimulated by her energy, her humor, her electric force. Nothing was said for a minute after his awkward declaration. "But," he persisted, "you like me, don't you?" "Of course I do. Immensely." "Then why?" "When a woman of my sort marries, it's a miracle. I'm 26 and intelligent and very successful. A frightful combination. Unmarried women of my type aren't content just to feel. They must analyze their feelings. And analysis is death to romance." "Great Scott! You expect to marry somebody sometime, don't you, Fanny?" "No one I know now. When I do marry, if I do, it will be with the idea of making a definite gain. I don't mean necessarily worldly gain, though that would be a factor, too." Fascinating Facts had been staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel with unnecessary rigidity. He relaxed a little now, and even laughed, though not very successfully. Then he said something very wise, for him. "Listen to me, girl. You'll never get away with that vampire stuff. Talons are things you have to be born with. You'll never learn to grab with these." He reached over and picked up her left hand lying inertly in her lap, and brought it up to his lips and kissed it, glove and all. They're built on the open face pattern, forgiving. You can't fool me. I know. A year and a half after her coming to Haynes Cooper, Fanny's department was doing a business of $1 million a year. The need had been there. She had merely given it the impetus. She was working more or less directly with Fenger now, with an eye on every one of the departments that had to do with women's clothing, from shoes to hats. Not that she did any actual buying or selling in these departments. She still confined her actual selecting of goods to the infants' wear section, but she occupied unofficially the position of assistant to the general merchandise manager. They worked well together, she and Fenger, their minds often marching along without the necessity of a single spoken word. There was no doubt that Fenger's mind was a marvelous piece of mechanism. Under it the Haynes Cooper plant functioned with the clockwork regularity of a gigantic automaton. System and results, these were his twin gods. With his mind intent on them, he failed to see that new gods, born of spiritual unrest, were being set up in the temples of big business. Their coming had been rumored for many years. Words such as brotherhood, labor, rights, humanity, ours, once regarded as the special property of the street corner ranter, were creeping into our everyday vocabulary. And strangely enough, Nathan Haynes, the gentle, the bewildered, the uninspired, heard them and listened. Nathan Haynes had begun to accustom himself to the roar of the flood that had formerly deafened him. He was no longer stunned by the inrush of his millions. The report sheet handed him daily had never ceased to be a wildly unexpected thing, and he still shrank from it sometimes. It was so fantastic, so out of all reason. But he even dared, now and then, to put out a tentative hand to guide the flood. He began to realize, vaguely, that Italian gardens and marble pools, educational endowments and pet charities were but poor, ineffectual barriers of mud and sticks, soon swept away by the torrent. As he sat there in his great, luxurious office, with the dim, rich old portraits gleaming down on him from the walls, he began, gropingly, to evolve a new plan. A plan by which the golden flood was to be curbed, divided, and made to form a substream to be utilized for the good of the many, for the good of the 10,000, who were almost 15,000 now, with another 15,000 in mills and factories at distant points, whose entire output was swallowed up by the Haynes Cooper plant. Michael Fenger, supermanager, listened to the plan, smiled tolerantly, and went on perfecting an already miraculous system. Sarah Sapinski, at 7 a week, was just so much untrained labor material, easily replaced by material exactly like it. No, Michael Fenger, with his head in the sand, heard no talk of new gods. He only knew that the monster plant under his management was yielding the greatest possible profit under the least possible outlay. In Fanny Brandeis he found a stimulating, energizing fellow worker. That had been from the beginning. In the first month or two of her work, when her keen brain was darting here and there into forgotten and neglected corners, ferreting out dusty scraps of business waste and holding them up to the light disdainfully, Fenger had watched her with a mingling of amusement and a sort of fond pride, as one would a precocious child. As the months went on, the pride and amusement welded into something more than admiration, such as one expert feels for a fellow craftsman. Long before the end of the first year he knew that here was a woman such as he had dreamed of all his life and never hoped to find. He often found himself sitting at his office desk, or in his library at home, staring straight ahead for a longer time than he dared admit, his papers or book forgotten in his hand. His thoughts applied to her adjectives which proved her a paradox: generous, sympathetic, warm-hearted, impulsive, imaginative, cold, indomitable, brilliant, daring, intuitive. He would rouse himself almost angrily and force himself to concentrate again upon the page before him. I don't know how he thought it all would end, he whose life habit it was to follow out every process to its ultimate step, whether mental or mechanical. As for Fanny, there was nothing of the intriguant about her. She was used to admiration. She was accustomed to deference from men. Brandeis's Bazaar had ensured that. All her life men had taken orders from her, all the way from Aloysius and the blithe traveling men of whom she bought goods, to the salesmen and importers in the Chicago wholesale houses. If they had attempted occasionally to mingle the social and personal with the commercial, Fanny had not resented their attitude. She had accepted their admiration and refused their invitations with equal good nature, and thus retained their friendship. It is not exaggeration to say that she looked upon Michael Fenger much as she had upon these genial fellow workers. A woman as straightforward and direct as she has what is known as a single-track mind in such matters. It is your soft and silken mollusk type of woman whose mind pursues a slimy and labyrinth trail. But it is useless to say that she did not feel something of the intense personal attraction of the man. Often it used to puzzle and annoy her to find that as they sat arguing in the brisk, everyday atmosphere of office or merchandise room, the air between them would suddenly become electric, vibrant. They met each other's eyes with effort. When their hands touched, accidentally, over papers or samples, they snatched them back. Fanny found herself laughing uncertainly at nothing, and was furious. When a silence fell between them they would pounce upon it, breathlessly, and smother it with talk. Do not think that any furtive love-making went on, sandwiched between shop talk. Their conversation might have taken place between two men. Indeed, they often were brutally frank to each other. Fanny had the vision, Fenger the science to apply it. Sometimes her intuition leaped ahead of his reasoning. Then he would say, "I'm not sold on that," which is modern business slang meaning, "You haven't convinced me." She would go back and start afresh, covering the ground more slowly. Usually her suggestions were practical and what might be termed human. They seemed to be founded on an uncanny knowledge of people's frailties. It was only when she touched upon his beloved system that he was adamant. "None of that socialistic stuff," he would say. "This isn't a benevolent association we're running. It's the biggest mail-order business in the world, and its backbone is system. I've been just 15 years perfecting that system. It's my job. Hands off." "A 15-year-old system ought to be scrapped," Fanny would retort boldly. "Anyway, the Simon Legree thing has gone out." No one in the plant had ever dared to talk to him like that. He would glare down at Fanny for a moment, like a mastiff on a terrier. Fanny, seeing his face rage red, would flash him a cheerful and impudent smile. The anger, fading slowly, gave way to another look, so that admiration and resentment mingled for a moment. "Lucky for you, you're not a man." "I wish I were." "I'm glad you're not." Not a very thrilling conversation for those of you who are seeking heartthrobs. In May, Fanny made her first trip to Europe for the firm. It was a sudden plan. Instantly Theodore leaped to her mind, and she was startled at the tumult she felt at the thought of seeing him and his child. The baby, a girl, was more than a year old. Her business, a matter of 2 weeks perhaps, was all in Berlin and Paris, but she cabled Theodore that she would come to them in Munich, if only for a day or two. She had very little curiosity about the woman Theodore had married. The memory of that first photograph of hers, befrizzed, bejeweled, and a smirk, had never effaced itself. It had stamped her indelibly in Fanny's mind. The day before she left for New York, she sailed from there, she had a letter from Theodore. It was evident at once that he had not received her cable. He was in Russia, giving a series of concerts. Olga and the baby were with him. He would be back in Munich in June. There was some talk of America. When Fanny realized that she was not to see him, she experienced a strange feeling that was a mixture of regret and relief. All the family love in her, a racial trait, had been stirred at the thought of again seeing that dear blond brother, the self-centered, willful, gifted boy who had held the little congregation rapt, there in the Jewish house of worship in Winnebago. But she had recoiled a little from the meeting with this other unknown person who gave concerts in Russia, who had adopted Munich as his home, who was the husband of this Olga person, and the father of a ridiculously German-looking baby in a very German-looking dress, all lace and tucks, and wearing bracelets on its chubby arms and a locket round its neck. That was what one might expect of Olga's baby, but not of Theodore's. Besides, what business had that boy with a baby anyway? Himself a baby. Fenger had arranged for her cabin, and she rather resented its luxury until she learned later that it is the buyers who always occupy the staterooms de luxe on ocean liners. She learned, too, that the men in yachting caps and white flannels, and the women in the smartest and most subdued of blue serge and furs, were not millionaires temporarily deprived of their own private seagoing craft, but buyers like herself, shrewd, aggressive, wise, and incredibly endowed with savoir-faire. Merely to watch one of them dealing with a deck steward was to know for all time the superiority of mind over matter. Most incongruously, it was Ella Monahan and Clarence Hail who waved goodbye to her as her ship swung clear of the dock. Ella was in New York on her monthly trip. Hale had appeared at the hotel as Fanny was adjusting her veil and casting a last rather wild look around the room. Molly Brandeis had been the kind of woman who never misses a train or overlooks a hairpin. Fanny's early training had proved invaluable more than once in the last 2 years. Nevertheless, she was rather flustered, for her, as the elevator took her down to the main floor. She told herself it was not the contemplation of the voyage itself that thrilled her. It was the fact that here was another step definitely marking her progress. Hale, looking incredibly limp, was leaning against a gaudy marble pillar, his eyes on the downcoming elevators. Fanny saw him just an instant before he saw her, and in that moment she found herself wondering why this boy, she felt years older than he, should look so fantastically out of place in this great, glittering, feverish hotel lobby. Just a shy, rather swarthy Jewish boy who wore the right kind of clothes in the wrong manner. Then Hale saw her and came swiftly toward her. "Hello, Fan!" "Hello, Clancy." They had not seen each other in 6 months. "Anybody else going down with you?" "No. Ella Monahan had a last-minute business appointment, but she promised to be at the dock somehow before the boat leaves. I'm going to be grand and taxi all the way." "I've an open car waiting." "But I won't have it. I can't let you do that." "Oh, yes, you can. Don't take it so hard. That's the trouble with you business women. You're killing the gallantry of a nation. Some day one of you will get up and give me a seat in a subway." "I'll punish you for that, Clancy. If you want the Jane Austen thing, I'll accommodate. I'll drop my handkerchief, gloves, bag, flowers, and fur scarf at intervals of 5 minutes all the way downtown. Then you may scramble around on the floor of the cab and feel like a knight." Fanny had long ago ceased to try to define the charm of this man. She always meant to be serenely dignified with him. She always ended by feeling very young and somehow gloriously carefree and light-hearted. There was about him a naturalness, a simplicity, to which one responded in kind. Seated beside her, he turned and regarded her with disconcerting scrutiny. "Like it?" demanded Fanny pertly, and smoothed her veil consciously. "No." "Well, for a man who looks negligee even in evening clothes, aren't you overcritical?" "I'm not criticizing your clothes. Even I can see that hat and suit have the repressed note that means money. And you're the kind of woman who looks her best in those plain, dark things." "Well, then?" "You'll look like a buyer. In 2 more years your face will have that hard finish that never comes off." "I am a buyer." "You're not. You're a creator. Remember, I'm not belittling your job. It's a wonderful job for Ella Monahan. I wish I had the gift of eloquence. I wish I had the right to spank you. I wish I could prove to you somehow that with your gift, and heritage, and racial right, it's as criminal for you to be earning your thousands at Haynes Cooper's as it would have been for a Vestal Virgin to desert her altar fire to stoke a furnace. Your eyes are bright and hard instead of tolerant. Your mouth is losing its graciousness. Your whole face is beginning to be stamped with a look that says shrewdness and experience and success." "I am successful. Why shouldn't I look it?" "Because you're a failure. I'm sick, I tell you, sick with disappointment in you. Jane Addams would have been a success in business, too. She was born with a humanity sense, and a value sense, and a something else that can't be acquired. Ida Tarbell could have managed your whole Haynes Cooper plant if she'd had to. So could a dozen other women I could name. You don't see any sign of what you call success on Jane Addams's face, do you? You wouldn't say on seeing her that here was a woman who looked as if she might afford $100 tailor suits in a town car. No. All you see in her face is the reflection of the souls of all the men and women she has worked to save. She has covered her job, the job that the Lord intended her to cover. And to me she is the most radiantly beautiful woman I have ever seen." Fanny sat silent. She was twisting the fingers of one hand in the grip of the other, as she had since childhood when deeply disturbed. And suddenly she began to cry, silently, harrowingly, as a man cries, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her furs. "Fanny! Fanny girl!" He was horribly disturbed and contrite. He patted her arm awkwardly. She shook free of his hand childishly. "Don't cry, dear. I'm sorry. It's just that I care so much. It's just—" She raised an angry, tear-stained face. "It's just that you have an exalted idea of your own perceptions. It's just that you've grown up from what they used to call a bright little boy to a bright young man, and you're just as tiresome now as you were then. I'm happy enough, except when I see you. I'm getting the things I starved for all those years. Why, I'll never get over being thrilled at the idea of being able to go to the theater or to a concert whenever I like, actually whenever I want to, and to be able to buy a jabot or a smart hat or a book. You don't know how I wanted things, and how tired I got of never having them. I'm happy. I'm happy. Leave me alone. It's an awful price to pay for a hat and a jabot and a book and a theater ticket, Fan. Ella Monahan had taken the tube, and was standing in the great shed watching arrivals with interest long before they bumped over the cobblestones of Hoboken. The three descended to Fanny's cabin. Ella had sent champagne, 6 cozy pints in a wicker basket. "They say it's good for seasickness," she announced cheerfully, "but it's a lie. Nothing's good for seasickness except death or dry land. But even if you do feel miserable, and you probably will, there's something about being able to lie in your berth and drink champagne alone, by the spoonful, that's sort of soothing." Hale had fallen silent. Fanny was radiant again, exclamatory over her books and flowers. "Of course, it's my first trip," she explained, "and an event in my life. But I didn't suppose that anybody else would care. What's this? Candy? Glacé fruit." She glanced around the luxurious little cabin, then up at Hale, impudently. "I may be a coarse commercial person, Clancy, but I must say I like this very, very much. Sorry." They went up on deck. Ella, a seasoned traveler, was full of parting instructions. "And be sure to eat at Kapinski's in Berlin. 20 cents for lobster, and caviar, big as hen's eggs and as cheap as codfish. And don't forget to order Maybole. It tastes like champagne, but it isn't, and it has the most delicious dwarf strawberries floating on top. This is just the season for it. You're lucky. If you tip the waiter 1 mark, he's yours for life. Oh, and remember the plum compote. You'll be disappointed in their Wertheims that they're always bragging about. After all, Field's makes them all look like country stores." "Wertheim's, is that something to eat, too?" "No, idiot, it's their big department store." Ella turned to Hale, for whom she felt mingled awe and liking. "If this trip of hers is successful, the firm will probably send her over 3 or 4 times a year. It's a wonderful chance for a kid like her." "Then I hope," said Hale quietly, "that this trip may be a failure." Ella smiled uncertainly. "Don't laugh," said Fanny sharply. "He means it." Ella, sensing an unpleasant something in which she had no part, covered the situation with another rush of conversation. "You'll get the jolt of your life when you come to Paris and find that you're expected to pay for the lunches and all the cab fares and everything of those shrimpy little commissionaires. Polite little fellows they are, in frock coats and mustaches, and they just stand aside as courtly as you please while you pay for everything. Their house expects it. I almost passed away the first time, but you get used to it. Say, imagine one of our traveling men letting you pay for his lunch and taxi." She rattled on, genially. Hale listened with unfeigned delight. Ella found herself suddenly abashed before those clear, far-seeing eyes. "You think I'm a gabby old girl, don't you?" "I think you're a wonderful woman," said Hale. "Very wise and very kind." "Why, thanks," faltered Ella. "Why, thanks." They said their good-byes. Ella hugged Fanny warm-heartedly. Then she turned away, awkwardly. Hale put his 2 hands on Fanny's shoulders and looked down at her. For a breathless second she thought he was about to kiss her. She was amazed to find herself hoping that he would. But he didn't. "Good-by," he said simply, and took her hand in his steel grip a moment and dropped it, and turned away. A messenger boy, very much out of breath, came running up to her, a telegram in his hand. "For me?" Fanny opened it, frowned, smiled. "It's from Mr. Fenger. Good wishes. As if all those flowers weren't enough." "Hmm," said Ella. She and Hale descended the gangway and stood at the dock's edge, looking rather foolish and uncertain, as people do at such times. There followed a few moments of scramble, of absurdly shouted last messages, of bells and frantic waving of handkerchiefs. Fanny, at the rail, found her two among the crowd and smiled down upon them, mistily. Ella was waving energetically. Hale was standing quite still, looking up. The ship swung clear, crept away from the dock. The good-byes swelled to a roar. Fanny leaned far over the rail and waved too, a sob in her throat. Then she saw that she was waving with the hand that held the yellow telegram. She crumpled it in the other hand and substituted her handkerchief. Hale still stood, hat in hand, motionless. "Why don't you wave good-by?" she called, though he could not possibly hear. "Wave good-by." And then the hand with the handkerchief went to her face, and she was weeping. I think it was that old drama thrill in her, dormant for so long. But at that, Hale swung his hat above his head 3 times like a schoolboy, and grasping Ella's plump and resisting arm, marched abruptly away. Chapter 15